Command, and he's going to do a presentation, Insights and Experiences of the U.S. Central Command. So I think that might be a very interesting presentation. So please come out. If you know anybody else that might be interested, certainly invite them as well. I think that'll be a very good presentation. So that brings us to this evening. I want to introduce Jim Iliff. Jim's a personal friend of ours. And actually, these four ladies and gentlemen in this corner are all UW Eau Claire grads. We're not going to tell you how long ago that was, but we're blue golds. So I know the next question will be, well, what the hell is a blue gold? You know, we always got that. So, but anyway, Jim has spent kind of a varied career, but most specifically being a pastor in United Church of Christ, and is recently retired. Jim is one of the guys we go to his cabin up north, or to a cabin up north, and he had on his phone the number of days to his retirement. You know.
It was in the thousands.
And it was in the thousands at the time. And this guy's really looking ahead, but Jim's kind of a planner, you know. But anyway, recently retired, and he's. I don't know if you recall, this was during COVID, we had some virtual presentations, two of them, in fact, on the Seminole Wars. And Jim gave a little kind of post-presentation talking about some of his family history. And I believe it's a great-great-grandfather that purchased some property that was from somebody who had received like a land grant because he was a veteran of what they called the Florida Wars. So anyway, thanks for sharing that Jim. Anyway, he's going to be talking this evening a little bit about, he's piqued by some interest of family genealogy, so that's kind of piqued this whole conversation, which leads to the presentation this evening. So anyway, I want to welcome Jim Iliff.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Very good, okay. I very much appreciate the opportunity to share, to speak to you and to share the story that actually, as Rich alluded to, has a connection to my own family. Last fall, as I was beginning my preparations for tonight's presentation, I happened to be reading a book on an entirely different subject. In the introduction, the author wrote about his accidental encounter with his subject. He said that it grabbed me by the collar, threw me upon the floor, sat upon my chest, and insisted upon being told. That expresses very well my own interest in the topic tonight. While it's of historical significance, my interest in it began not just as history, but as family history, my own family history. In the fall of 1979, my grandmother, Velma Iliff, died. It fell to my parents and my aunt and uncle to clear out her house and get it ready to be sold. Along with the clothing, dishes, bedding, furniture, and all the rest that was accumulated over 50 years, a lot of documents, books, pictures saw the light of day for the first time in a long time. They were filled with names I'd never heard and faces I'd never seen. The question I asked that day and that I've been trying to answer ever since is, who are these people? I first encountered the organizations I'll be talking about tonight while in the process of answering that question. It's one of the many rabbit trails I've followed over the past 4 decades. Subjects that may have a direct bearing on my research, but others that just simply interested me and expanded my understanding of the times in which my ancestors lived and of the factors that may have impacted them. Now, I don't bring any particular academic credentials to this task. My college degrees are in various unrelated fields. I've learned historical and genealogical research by doing it. Much of it was done before the internet, so I visited many courthouses, churches, libraries, and archives. I've learned from a variety of professionals and non-professionals over the years. Like most of you, I am an amateur in the truest, fullest sense of the word. I love what I do and find great value and a sense of fulfillment as I've moved my research along and reached farther and farther into the past. But inevitably, my own family's history has intersected with wider historical events time and time again. For example, I have 2 direct ancestors and numerous collateral relatives who fought in the Civil War. Not long ago, my wife and I traveled to Vicksburg and saw for the first time the grave of my 2 times great-grandfather. I have a great uncle who served in World War I. My father, uncle, and a number of cousins were World War II veterans. And the brother of my 2 times great-grandfather, the one who's buried at Vicksburg, served in the Marines during the Mexican War and sailed around the world. Their lives connected with and were swept along by these and many other historical events. And the same is true regarding my subject tonight, organizational support for emigration to Wisconsin in the 1800s. During the first decade I was working on my family tree, I came upon an article in an old issue of the Wisconsin Magazine of History. It referred to 2 emigration groups during the mid-1800s. The first was the British Temperance Emigration Society, the first of the 2 that I'll be talking about tonight. The second reference came just a paragraph later and spoke of a group of immigrant potters from Staffordshire. Members of these groups settled in southern and central Wisconsin right around the time Wisconsin entered the Union. A little research showed me that my own ancestors were part of the first group. I learned much later that a friend of mine who grew up in the Portage area knew descendants of the people who were part of the second. The literature about immigration speaks both of its push and its pull. Most of the reasons on each list should be very familiar to us, but there are a few that were surprising, at least surprising to me. First, the pushes. It's not surprising to any of us that some of the biggest pushes were economic in nature. Famine and poverty, overpopulation, and lack of economic opportunity are central reasons why many people, including the ancestors of most of us here this evening, chose to leave their homes and move into the unknown. But there were also some value-based reasons they came here. Politics, especially from areas with repressive rulers, was a significant factor. The effort to develop a more just and equitable society was high on many lists. Those of you who know the history of Milwaukee may know about the influence that German immigrants had on the governance of that city. Committed as they were to community solidarity and economic equality, they elected a number of socialist mayors over the years and other representatives right up into the 1950s. Religion was, of course, also a significant reason for many. One push that surprised me was the economic incentive some people were given to leave their homes. Some cities and nations found it more prudent to pay people to leave rather than bring about the necessary changes at home. But then there was also the pull. Some of these factors were the yin to the push's yang. Here in the US, there was available land, growing economic opportunity, increased freedom, and, the subject of my talk, government and institutional efforts to try to attract immigrants to a new homeland. My original plan for this presentation was to include a section on the state of Wisconsin's Commissioner on Immigration. Yes, the state of Wisconsin actually allocated funds to a government agency to try to attract immigrants to Wisconsin. But the length of my presentation compelled me to eliminate that section. Perhaps that can become a future program. To illustrate my point both of the push and pull of immigration, here's the entry for Jonah Pointer, my 3 times great-grandfather, and his family in the 1841 England and Wales census. Note Notice that all family members 13 years of age and older had occupations. This was hardly unique for this time period. Survival, putting food on the table, required everyone's efforts, and once children received a basic education, they were put to work. Sometimes they were put to work even without an education. You can imagine that if you were in this situation, you might also decide that a major change was in order. Surely there's something better than that. In my presentation tonight, I'm going to focus on the two groups I've already mentioned, both originating in England, who made an effort to organize immigrants to come to this country. But before I get to them, I just want to mention a couple of interesting utopian movements that had planted immigrant communities in Wisconsin. The first is the Fourierist movement. It was based on the writings of Charles Fourier, a French social theorist who advocated the reconstruction of society based on communal associations he called phalanges. He felt that phalanges would distribute wealth more equitably than under capitalism, and that they could be introduced into any political system. Individuals were rewarded on the basis of the total productivity of the organization. The most famous Fourier community in the US was the short-lived Brook Farm in Massachusetts. And here I list a couple of communities, several communities here in Wisconsin based on his model. The other communities were based on the work of Robert Owen, a Welsh textile manufacturer, philanthropist, and social reformer who inherited the new Lanark Mill in Scotland and used it to put his progressive social views into practice. He championed the 8-hour day, built improved housing for his employees, provided daycare and improved education for their children, and made sure his employees had a greater share of the company's profits. He came to the US in the 1820s to found additional communities based on this model. The most famous is the one located in New Harmony, Indiana, but there were dozens others around the country, including these several in Wisconsin. So first I'll talk about the British Temperance Emigration Society, the organization my ancestors were a part of. This is a map of northwestern Dane County in the village of Mazomanie. If you've driven Highway 14 west from the village, perhaps on your way to American Players Theater or House on the Rock, you've driven by this small park with a historical marker. The title on the marker is Village of Dover, but it's really about this organization. It was founded on December 26, 1842 at Samuel Roberts' Temperance Coffee Shop in Liverpool, England. It was one of many such organizations that were founded around this time. British society and economy had been undergoing a revolutionary transformation, starting really picking up speed in the 1700s and continuing well into the 1800s. Prior to this, theirs had been a largely subsistence agrarian economy where the open fields, nominally held by a powerful lord, would be shared out among the peasants, who paid rent in cash, produce, or service, and grew food on these long strips of land to provide for their families. While land use and ownership had started changing in a few places before this, the Enclosure Act of 1773 provided for the enclosure of land, meaning the transformation of land formerly used for subsistence farming by local peasants into private land held by a few individuals for large-scale agriculture. Between 1604 and 1914, there were more than 5,200 enclosure bills affecting 6.8 million acres of land, about 1/5 the total area of England. This meant that people who previously had fed their families from the land no longer had access to it. A large number of dispossessed people streamed into the cities and provided a ready supply of cheap labor for the then rapidly growing industrial sector of England. These families often lived in substandard housing without clean water and sanitation. Those of you who know the history of 19th century England know it was a time not only of rapid industrialization, but also of festering social, economic, and environmental problems. There were some who looked at this situation and felt that the only way to improve upon it was to start over somewhere else. Emigration to places like the US was their solution for the improvement of society and the lives of people. This was indeed a major movement within British society. According to Max Berger in his book, The British Traveller in America, between 1836 and 1869, there were approximately 230 books and pamphlets published by people that touted the advantages of life in America and encouraged emigration for people who saw little or no chance for economic advancement in England. Bill showed me a book he possesses now. That was a German equivalent of this, where it attempted to describe in a very thorough way what life was like in Wisconsin in order to induce German immigrants to come and stake their fortunes here. The founders of the society were Robert Gorst, Charles Wilson, and Charles Reeves, all employees of a company that manufactured and sold nautical equipment in Liverpool, a major seaport at the time. This is a picture of Robert Gorst. Unfortunately, it's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, so you can see that it looks a little rough. Not only was he a promoter of immigration, but he was also an itinerant Methodist lay preacher. He traveled across the English Midlands preaching both the gospel of the Christian faith and the gospel of the British Temperance Emigration Society. Lawrence Hayworth, a member of Parliament from Liverpool, became interested in the society, serving as an officer and later sending his own sons to visit the Wisconsin homesteads the society had secured for its members. There is one primary source and three important secondary sources for the society. The first, and really one of the more interesting ones, is the Robert Gorst papers at the Wisconsin State Historical Society. I've had the privilege to spend some very pleasurable hours going through all the miscellaneous documents in that collection. There's a book published in 1900 by William Kittle, The History of the Township and Village of Mazomanie. An article in the Bulletin of the British Association for American Studies called English Settlers in Early Wisconsin by Vivian Vale. And finally, a book by Frank Wolf, who is a local amateur historian, called Ghost Town Dover and the British Temperance Emigration Society. I actually have copies of several of these things up here. The objectives of the society were really three. The first was to raise funds by weekly subscription to purchase land in Wisconsin. It wanted to allow immigration at the least possible expense and as in short time as possible, and finally to provide an investment opportunity for people who may not want to emigrate, but who wanted to get some return on an investment. Although the society had originated in Liverpool, they maintained offices in a number of cities across England, including London. Nearly 1,000 men became members, and all the members, in fact, were men. Many of them were from the counties around Liverpool: Lancashire, Cheshire, Worcestershire, and Staffordshire. But Yorkshire and Lincolnshire in eastern and northeastern England accounted for nearly 40% of the total. Leicestershire, the home county of my ancestors, had just under 5% of the total. Here's a membership list that includes my ancestor, who I've mentioned already, Jonah Pointer, member 248. In the first annual report, published exactly 1 year after their founding, they reported income of £671, 12 shillings and 5 pence, and expenses of £68, 10 shillings and 6 pence. But in a rather troubling fact, they showed member accounts in arrears of more than £500. Cash shortages, among other things, would plague the society during its entire existence. In 1848, the society published the description of the Wisconsin Territory, one of the 230-odd guidebooks I mentioned earlier. This one was followed the next year by the Immigrants Instructor on Wisconsin and the Western United States. Essentially the first and second edition of the same pamphlet, they provided a description of Wisconsin's climate, rivers, animals, and soil. They included testimonial letters from dozens of people, both prior immigrants from Britain and also civic leaders, including the governor of Wisconsin Territory, Henry Dodge. We heard a presentation about Henry Dodge here at the roundtable last year, I believe. All of them extolling the virtues of Wisconsin. There was information about the value of money, prices of commodities, and the potential for growth. There were descriptions of the two primary routes to get to Wisconsin, one either through New York City or New Orleans, and each copy sold for 6 pence. By the end of 1843, the Society had sold 327 shares. By the end of the next year, the total had more than doubled to 752, but only 180 shares were sold in all of 1845. This, coupled with lagging payments I mentioned earlier, would cause some significant problems. Mr. and Mrs. Charles Wilson were the first Society members to come to Wisconsin. They arrived in New York City in the fall of 1843 and made the long journey up the Hudson River, along the Erie Canal, through the Great Lakes, arriving in Milwaukee in November of that year. The trip across southern Wisconsin must have been difficult, since there were few roads across the state at that time. Most later Society members entered the U.S. through New Orleans. Then it was a much easier trip up the Mississippi by steamboat to Galena, then following existing roads through the lead mining district of southwestern Wisconsin to the Society estates in present-day Iowa, Columbia, and Dane counties. Mr. Wilson was joined by several other Society members who helped with the identification and purchase of parcels of land for the members. Here's a map produced by the Society showing the parcels they had purchased. To help orient you, this is the county line between Iowa and Dane counties. So the clusters up just to the right of that line near the top would be approximately where Mazomanie is now. You can see the 80-acre tracts sprinkled across this area, often in clusters. After they purchased the land, though, their problems were just beginning. They had encountered a number of difficulties that they likely hadn't anticipated. The Society had promised their members that when they arrived, they would find their farms ready for occupation, with log houses already erected, fences built, and 5 acres under cultivation. But this proved to be a nearly insurmountable task. Labor was in short supply. Items needed to accomplish these tasks were difficult to find and expensive when they did. And there was very little hard currency to pay for expenses. The first group of immigrants arrived in the summer of 1844. There were 13 families, totaling 58 people. Robert Gorst, with his wife and 3 children, arrived in 1845. He became the principal leader of the Society in Wisconsin, and it was largely due to his efforts that the Society survived as long as it did. In anticipation of the arrival of the second group, this advertisement appeared in the Wisconsin State Journal in 1844, looking to hire people to build cabins on their new properties. Here's a selected list of expenses found on a report in the Robert Gorst papers, listing various expenses: wages, lumber, nails, grubbing out stumps, and so on. My own ancestors were part of the group that immigrated in 1846, along with nearly 100 other people. There were 2 main clusters of these communities, one around Dover, near present-day Mazomanie, and another in northern Dane County, clustered around what was known as Lester Settlement. Nothing remains of it today, but it was located just north of present-day Waunakee. This is where my own ancestors settled. In fact, my 2-time great-grandparents' farm was located at the corner of present-day Highway 19, 113, and County Truck Q. Their house sat where the Wanakee Village Hall currently sits. When the railroad was built in 1870, the company chose to lay its tracks south of Leicester Settlement. It was on that route that the village of Wanakee began to grow. Gradually, residents and businesses of Leicester Settlement relocated to the new village, and what remained of Leicester Settlement gradually disappeared. The Robert Gorse Papers contains a number of documents either referring to my ancestor Jonah Pointer or actually written by Jonah himself. This one is an accounting of what Jonah owed the society for his land and other improvements, along with back dues. Among the documents was several copies of his signature, a very treasured find. And no, I did not steal any of the documents from out of the archive. I basically made copies, although I must say I was slightly tempted. Despite the noble intentions and great effort to fulfill their purpose, the society was in trouble almost from the beginning. As noted above, payments on shares lagged from the start and never improved. Because of the scarcity of hard currency and the near subsistence economy on the Wisconsin frontier, settlers found themselves unable to pay the annual rent and other costs associated with their farms. Members complained about the conduct of society agents who pressured them to pay their overdue fees. Promised improvements on the farms often did not happen or happened very slowly. Markets for their farm products were far away and transportation was costly. And very few of the settlers had been farmers in England, requiring them to learn how to farm and no doubt making many mistakes along the way. On May 7, 1849, a meeting was held at the house of Samuel Roberts in Liverpool to assess the situation. The society had no cash on hand and carried debts of 30 pounds. The reports by society members of the strong-arm tactics that agents had used to collect rents and dues were shared. One of the Wisconsin agents had resigned. Several others complained that they had not been paid. In hopes of infusing the society with much-needed cash, an emergency assessment of 1 shilling for each share was urged. And they proposed to enter into new endeavors in the hope of making the new settlement financially viable. I think of these as the Hail Marys. The first Hail Mary was the British Temperance Mill Company. Since the community's cash crop was wheat, it made sense to have control of the milling process. This scheme had been proposed by members of the Society's Sheffield, England branch. A prospectus for the new society was included with the Society's 1847 annual report. But by January 1848, only 126 pounds in shares had been purchased. The directors back in England raised the question whether this project should continue. There's no further mention of it in the Society's records, and old-time settlers of the area told later historians that no mill was ever built. The second Hail Mary was the Hayworth Manufacturing Company. Land was purchased by the Society along the Wisconsin River near Helena, a short distance west of present-day Arena. 1,000 shares at 6 shillings 6 pence each, about $1.62, were to be sold. $100 was promised to the first person to build a building on the site. But there was a very tepid response to this as well. Only a few buildings were built and the project collapsed. 4 years of legal wrangling between the society and the few stockholders ended in an out-of-court settlement, with the loan canceled and the land allotted to the project returned to the society. The third and final Hail Mary was the Wisconsin Steamboat Company. Given the close proximity of the Dover community to the Wisconsin River, this might have been a profitable enterprise. An organizational meeting was held on April 1st, 1848, and a notice was published in a Madison newspaper. But other than this published notice, it doesn't appear that any action was ever taken. This was the last throw of the dice, the last attempt to make the organization sustainable. During the 1850s, society agents in England and Wisconsin tried to wind up the society's business, but internal dissension as well as lawsuits filed both in England and Wisconsin prolonged the process. When exactly the society finally went out of existence isn't known. A letter from Robert Gorst on December 24, 1861, seeking advice on the selling of society lands is the last surviving record of the society. Of all the people who tried to make this endeavor work, much of the credit should be given to Robert Gorst. He seems to have borne the brunt of the anger and conflict of settlers here in Wisconsin. The friendships he'd had with other founders came to an end in conflict and recrimination. He came to regret that he'd ever been associated with the society. Writing in 1856, he said, "Had I known what I must have suffered in body, mind, in character and spiritual pursuits through the society's affairs, from first to the present time, the treasures of Great Britain would not have induced me to undertake the offices I have held." He died in 1863. Despite all the troubles, the society managed to bring over nearly 700 men, women, and children to settle on the Wisconsin frontier. In his book, and I have a copy of it right up here, Wolf includes a list of immigrants and their families and also of later immigrants to the Mazomanie area, many of whom were society members, but of course many others who came on their own. It's an interesting story, not well known, but one that I found fascinating about a little known story in our own Dane County. I move now to talk about the Potters Joint Stock Emigration Society and Savings Fund that resettled Staffordshire Potters and their families onto land in present-day Columbia and Marquette counties. This is a much better documented movement than the British Temperance Emigration Society. I discovered a number of books and articles that included descriptions of this book and that were dedicated entirely to it. Here's a select bibliography. 2 articles from the Wisconsin Magazine of History, one by Grant Foreman from 1848, another one by Roger Bentley that was published in 2010. Andrew Jackson Turner, the Potters Emigration Society and the History of Columbia County. And on the website, chipstone.org, Miranda Goodby's Our Home in the West, Staffordshire Potters and their immigration to America in the 1840s. The county of Staffordshire in England was one of the primary centers of industrialization in England. Coal, steel, textiles, and pottery were among the principal products. As was the case with many of the rapidly industrializing cities in England and elsewhere, living conditions were horrendous, as described by researcher and author Roger Bentley. Famous for the names of pottery manufacturers such as Wedgwood, Spode, and Minton, among others, Staffordshire suffered from some of the worst urban living conditions in the whole country. The population lived and worked in Dickensian towns filled with smoking chimneys, grime, dirt, and dangerously overcrowded housing. The Potters were affected by a variety of industrial diseases. Silicosis, for example, known as Potter's rot, a form of lung disease caused by the inhalation of silica dust, was widespread. Life expectancy was short. In the 1840s, branded the Hungry 40s, a severe depression struck the country and brought particularly hard times to the Potters. Unemployment was widespread, and money was tight. Against this background, the Potters formed a labor union entitled the United Branches of Pottery Operatives in 1843. At its head was William Evans, pictured here on the title page of Bentley's 2010 Wisconsin Magazine of History article. Born in Wales in 1806, he'd come to Staffordshire as a young man to work in the pottery industry. Deeply affected by the miserable conditions of his fellow potters, he used his position as a union leader to try to improve their living and working conditions. In December 1843, he started publishing the Potter's Examiner and Workman's Advocate, with the intention of promoting Potter's interests. It also included Evans' own opinions and observations on local events. Starting in early 1844, he began including letters from immigrants to America who described an idyllic life in a comfortable cabin surrounded by a land flowing with milk and honey. This was the beginning of the new idea that Evans had had. Rather than continuing to support unemployed potters and their families with payments from union coffers, it would be better to use these funds to support a scheme to relocate some of these families to America. Theoretically, that would improve the lives of the immigrants while also improving the lives of the potters who remained behind, since the labor pool would have become smaller. One reader and immigration enthusiast penned the following poem that appeared in the pages of the Potter's Examiner. Hark, hark to the strain, let us hear it again, from a bark that is bearing away from the quay. It's a pioneer band that departs from the land to establish a home for the brave and the free. Farewell, sing the crew as they sail from our view. The land of the pauper is not for the free. We sail for the west, where the weary shall rest, and the Bastille of England no more shall we see. The tyrants of state, in their pride and their hate, have driven their thousands to premature graves. The lives of the poor they think of no more, nay, less than the planters would think of their slaves. Farewell and away, o'er the bright bounding spray sing the bold pioneers as they dash o'er the waves. There's health in the gale as it fills every sail and bears us away to the home of the brave. The dear friends we leave, for them we may grieve, and may offer a tribute to memory dear. For the sorrow and care they are all doomed to bear, will ever call forth to our eyelids a tear. But away with the pain, we shall see them again. We are only preparing a way for the rest. Then blow, breezes blow, as onward we go. The potters shall yet have a home in the West. Evans' dream became a reality on May 20th, 1844, when the Potters Immigration Society had its first general meeting. Evans was elected as agent and head of the Immigration Committee. Shares in the society sold for £1 each and could be paid in installments by the Potters. Union branches also purchased shares. Their plan was to buy 12,000 acres of land in one of the western states and to resettle Potters and their families there. As soon as there were sufficient funds to pay for the first parcels of land, a lottery would be held among the shareholders to see who would emigrate first and receive an allotment of 20 acres, 5 already under cultivation, a log cabin, an account at the company store, and the cost of their passage paid by the society. Payment for the land and other goods and services would be made in installment over 10 years. At the invitation of the aforementioned Henry Dodge, governor of Wisconsin Territory, they resolved to resettle in Wisconsin. 3 land officers, Hamlet Copeland, John Sawyer, and James Hammond, were sent to Wisconsin to purchase the land. The purchases were delayed first when the funds were late in arriving. Then agents had difficulty converting their foreign bank drafts into cash in this country. Finally, they were able to purchase 1,600 acres in Scott Township, Columbia County, far less than the 12,000 acres they'd hoped to buy. But this was all that the available funds would allow. Signs of more trouble to come. On April 6, 1847, that was the day that the first immigrants departed England. There were 14 families, 8 of them chosen to represent the various branches of the Union. The Potter's Examiner reported that some 20,000 people were on hand for the event at the Etruria Pottery Factory Wharf. Banners and flags were flying, enthusiastic and emotional farewell speeches were delivered, and a farewell tune was played by the Hanley Temperance Band. Hanley was a nearby community. They headed down the Trent and Mersey Canal to Liverpool, where they boarded a ship bound for New York. Arriving in New York City about a month later, they followed much the same route as the first immigrants from the British Temperance Emigration Society. First the Hudson River, then the Erie Canal, the Great Lakes, arriving in Milwaukee, where they were met by one of the agents. When they arrived in Scott Township, they discovered that only 4 cabins were under construction, none of them completed. No land had been cleared and no crops had been planted. It fell to the immigrants themselves to build their own houses, clear their own land, and plant their own crops. While these were serious problems, the bigger, more immediate one was access to food. Isaac Smith, a part of the first group of immigrants, reminisced about the first winter some 30 years later in an article printed in the Portage Daily Register in 1878, where he wrote, "For the space of 9 days we never saw bread of any description, and the only means of our subsistence was a few heads of wheat rubbed out with our hands, then boiled." Sounds yummy, doesn't it? Here's a picture of Isaac Smith with his wife Sarah in later years. Despite that first hard winter, things began to improve. The first years of settlement in the community they called Pottersville were encouraging. More families arrived, swelling their numbers to around 150 in 1848. Additional houses were being built, and there was now oxen. Uh-oh, did we lose it? Yeah. All right, I'll just talk loud. As Rich told you, I'm a former pastor, so I can use my pastor voice for the rest of the presentation. There were now oxen, horses, and plows, and other farm implements at their disposal. But economic conditions were still challenging. Hard currency was difficult to come by. The nearest mill for the grain was 20 miles away, then another 90 miles to transport it to market in Milwaukee. Despite the promising start, the society was more and more in trouble. The Potters Union funds had dried up. It appeared that Evans' dream might die there. But in an ingenious attempt to keep the society alive, Evans proposed to open it up to people from other trades. At a special meeting in May of 1848, the members approved this plan, but previously had been a localized scheme for people in a particular trade, then became a national plan embracing all working people. Membership grew significantly. Within 12 months, there were over 100 new branches of the society. So that looked better, but things quickly began deteriorating here in the U.S. But on New Year's Day, 1849, some 2,000 people gathered in the auditorium of the Free Trade Hall in Manchester for the lottery to select that year's immigrants. One of them was William Scholes, a cotton mill worker from Oldham in Lancashire. He said he was thankful that ever I heard of the Potters Immigration Society and grateful to have the chance to escape a stinking factory. With this new lease on life, Evans set his sights higher. He sent over Thomas Twigg to manage the settlement and to purchase even more land. Twigg focused his attention on land in Moundville Township, Marquette County, and also land just south of it in Fort Winnebago Township, Columbia County. He set up his base of operations along the side of the Fox River, where he began a ferry business that he called Emancipation Ferry, and he also opened a general store there. There's an historical marker on the site of Twig's settlement at the intersection of County Trunk M and T, just 6 miles north of Portage. But unlike Pottersville, this land wasn't purchased by the society. In fact, it couldn't be. It was still Indian land, not due to be transferred to the federal government until 1850, then surveyed and made available for purchase. By custom, those who had already settled on the land would have preference in purchasing it. One of the first residents of Twiggs Landing, as it was called, was the aforementioned William Shoals. In a letter published in the Potter's Examiner, Shoals declared that he had 35 acres of first-rate plowing land and 6 acres of marshland for hay and cattle. Another recent immigrant, William Mountford, declared that I still like this country so much that I would not go back to England if someone would pay my expenses. But all of this proved to be a false spring. From its very beginning, Evans had been criticized by various opponents who saw the immigration scheme as unpatriotic, a misuse of union resources, and simply doomed to fail. In a concerted effort to defeat his opponents, he recalled Twigg, who had barely arrived in Wisconsin, to embark on a 9-week tour of England and Scotland to refute Evans's enemies and build new support for the society. That effort seemed to have been successful, but it came at a cost. The new settlement hadn't been well established prior to Twiggs' return to England, and his assistant proved unequal to the task. When Twigg returned in April 1850, he found the community in disarray. A large number of settlers had arrived, but nothing had been made ready for them. The inventory of the general store had been depleted, and there were no funds to restock it. This began the battle of the newspapers. The Potter's Examiner continued to print positive reports and glowing testimonials, while negative and critical ones showed up in other newspapers. A letter from a recent immigrant named Bold Hilton appeared in the July 30, 1850 issue of the Manchester Examiner. He informed the paper's readers that when he arrived at Twiggs Landing, the store was practically empty. He'd been given some bread, a little pork, and some coffee without sugar. The land near the ferry showed no sign of cultivation, and he was given vague directions to his own land, meaning no one really knew where it was. People were in a state of bewilderment and destitution, he said. Hundreds were looking for jobs, but there were none to be had. Taken all together, he wrote, it's one of the most miserable places on earth. Hilton's letter was followed by even more, raising many of the same complaints. They also accused the proprietors of overcharging for goods and of favoritism and corruption by society officials. One settler from Scotland, after he arrived at Twiggs Landing, only to be told that there was no land for him, made the following assessment. It is a mistake to call it Emancipation Ferry. It should be called Desolation Ferry. Evans tried to defend himself and the society, but he made matters worse by blaming the agents both in England and in Wisconsin. They had sent out too many settlers, he complained, some of whom purchased items from the store on credit and then deserted the community without paying. This sort of finger-pointing put Evans in an even worse light. In response to the problems and controversies, influential members of the society pushed for Evans' removal and for the affairs of the society to be governed by shareholders. Settlers already in Wisconsin also tried to make their complaints heard. At a June 5, 1850 meeting held at Fort Winnebago, which had been abandoned by the military some 5 years earlier, they drew up a petition addressed to the people of Great Britain regarding the conditions at Twiggs Landing. The land is at present in the possession of the Indians, and therefore all settlers are considered trespassers. The greater part of the land is sandy or wet marshland, and in the opinion of many practical men, very unsuitable for farming. Employment cannot be got for many miles around. Numbers of settlers have been obliged to leave and wander through the country homeless and penniless, and have in some cases died, leaving families without support. The stores, so-called, seldom contain even the common necessities of life. The settlers called upon the British public to investigate the society. The petition was first printed in the Fort Winnebago Times that summer, and then in several English newspapers a few months later. A report to the Society on Conditions in Wisconsin was made by George W. Robinson, who had been hired as secretary and bookkeeper for the Society in Wisconsin. He'd accompanied Thomas Twigg when he returned to the settlement. His report contained a long list of problems. The harvest that year had been a failure. Emigrants continued arriving, but there were no funds to build cabins, clear farmland, and plant crops. Goods that had been purchased for the settlers had to be given to their creditors to settle their debts. This was a result of a judgment made in Columbia County Court to seize the goods and chattels of the society, along with 700 acres of land to settle debts that Twigg had incurred. This included some of the farmsteads on which several earlier immigrant families were living. The courts allowed the immigrants a grace period to find the means to purchase their own land before the land was sold. Some were able to come up with the money to purchase their farms themselves, while others were forced to abandon them. Residents at Twigg's Landing were in a strange position, since the land they were living on was still Indian land and only gradually being surveyed and made available for purchase. It wasn't until 1852 that they were able to purchase their property at the Federal Land Office in Menasha, a one-way trip of 90 miles. At least two of the immigrants, William Mountford and Isaac Smith, acquired their land by other means. They purchased bounty land certificates, like the one I show here, from veterans of the War of 1812 and used them to secure their land. As was mentioned before, I gave a short presentation about bounty land certificates here to the society, or to the round table. It was a way the federal government could reward veterans for their military service. Earlier, these certificates weren't transferable, but an act of Congress in 1852 changed that. So Mountford and Smith were among the first non-veterans to purchase certificates and use them to acquire land. Here's an extended quote from Roger Bentley's article. The failure of the Potter's Emigration Society was a disaster for a great many people. Of the settlers in Wisconsin, some returned to the British Isles, while others went to find work and settle elsewhere. But there were also those who remained to work and put down roots. Some achieved prosperity, eventually becoming prominent members of the community. John Sawyer and Henry Dooley, for example, went on to become successful farmers. But not so an unhappy Benjamin Hopkins. Unable to adapt to life as a farmer, he eventually found solace in his Baptist church and organized a Good Templars lodge. Isaac Smith became a popular Sunday preacher in Moundville and served as Justice of the Peace, town chairman, coroner, and local magistrate. George W. Robinson became prominent in local government. He served as the public notary in Moundville and later was appointed clerk of the Marquette County Circuit Court. William Scholes enlisted in the Union Army in the Civil War and died at Vicksburg. William Mountford lost two sons-in-law in the war. Martin Ellison served with his two sons in the Union Army and eventually became clerk for Marquette County. The unfortunate Thomas Twigg, condemned by his fellow settlers and stricken with silicosis he contracted from his days as a potter, barely outlived his colony. He died in early March 1851 and is buried at Twigg's Landing. In England, Evans' newspaper folded along with the Emigration Society. Although the society had been a disaster for so many of the potters, Evans was defiant and unrepentant to the end, claiming that this great, good, and benevolent movement was destroyed by selfish and designing men, bringing the founder and his family to ruin. He left the potteries and died in obscurity in Lancashire in 1887. Unlike the British Temperance Emigration Society, I haven't found a definitive estimate of the number of people who emigrated under the auspices of the Potter's Emigration Society. Grant Foreman, in the final paragraph of his 1938 article, claimed to have found 15 families in a plat map of Moundville Township, Marquette County, who are the descendants of original Potter's Society families. Foreman also reported on a survey of the 1860 federal census made by Dr. Joseph Schaefer, who at the time was superintendent of the Wisconsin State Historical Society. He had looked at census records of Scott and Fort Winnebago townships in Columbia County, and Mountville and Buffalo townships in Marquette County, and found 83 families of English-born potters still living there. I did my own count in Columbia County, but of the 1850 census instead. That puts us closer to the events described in this presentation. This census was the first one that listed all white residents by name and included other information such as places of birth. Here are the places of birth for people in Scott Township. You see a number of people who were born in the U.S., but quite a number who were born in other foreign parts. About a third of the total were born outside the United States. There were quite a few more people living in Fort Winnebago Township, which, as the name suggests, is near the fort and the village of Portage. New York, 269, Wisconsin, 178, and so on, along with many who were from foreign parts. The Irish number really intrigued me. Why there were so many Irish people. Of course, this is just after the potato famine, so I'm sure there were many people who had immigrated, but I'm sure there's a story as to why they came to that spot, the one that I wasn't able to find. And the other foreign number includes lots of Canadians, Germans, Scandinavians, and even a few people from places like Switzerland and Austria. In both townships, almost everyone born in Wisconsin was a child. While the founders had good intentions, neither society fully understood the challenges they were taking on. Life on the frontier was quite different from life in English cities, something neither group fully took into account. It was only through the resilience and determination of those settlers who came to Wisconsin and remained here that anything resembling success was achieved. Many hundreds of people found their way to Wisconsin through the efforts of these societies and their members, and whatever their failures, many thousands of people alive today owe these organizations their thanks for assisting their ancestors to make their way to a new land. And I am proud to be one of them. Thank you very much.
Jim?
Yeah.
So those deeds of grant that were given to soldiers, did they have legal descriptions on them? Were these
The bounty land warrants or the certificates,
Yeah.
when they first came out, were for land in a particular area. So, for instance, upstate New York, some of you may know this story. There was a huge area up there that was the military district, kind of near where Syracuse is now. And so Revolutionary War soldiers were given certificates that were redeemable for land in that location. There were other reserves set aside in other places around the country that served a similar purpose. But after a while, these certificates could be used to could be redeemed for land anywhere, and eventually then became negotiable. You could sell them. So if you didn't want to leave the place you were living, you could sell it and get some money for it. And you know this is in lieu of pensions, because early on the federal government was pretty cash poor, but they were land rich, so they could, you know, and so it fell to the veteran themselves then, when it became legal to sell these certificates.
So how did they get taken out of circulation?
They stopped being issued.
No, I mean, so you had one.
Oh, you would go to a land office and one of these land, like there was one in Mineral Point, there was one in Menasha, I didn't know that until this, and others around the country. And so you would take this certificate there and then could redeem it for a certain number of acres.
Yeah.
But it wasn't, it didn't, you could then redeem it for any piece of land that was available anywhere.
Of that amount of acreage.
Of that amount of acreage,
Right.
correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Help me with the Temperance Society. Didn't touch you once on the Temperance part of it.
Uh-huh.
But was it the temperance society shipping drugs to America? Or did
Yeah.
the temperance part play much into what they were doing?
It was not part of sort of their core purposes. One author says it maybe was meant as a way of attracting people of a certain temperament or a certain understanding, to this effort. As many of you know, in addition to some of the issues of poverty in the cities of England, there was also a very serious problem of alcohol abuse and often domestic violence and other kinds of things. So it wasn't just about drinking. It was about the violence being done to especially women and children. And John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, was one of his sort of the pillars of this new movement, because he saw what damage excessive alcohol consumption was doing to individuals and communities and so on. And even, I grew up United Methodist, and even through my childhood there was some pretty strong prohibitions, or at least warnings against the consumption of alcohol. And I don't think any Methodist church ever has used wine during communion. It's always grape juice, so far as I know. I've not been in every single Methodist church, but I know that was a very strong principle that they wanted to uphold. So, and I know several of the members that I've researched a little bit more closely, including my own ancestors, were very much of that temperament. What's it called? The Oddfellows lodges. Some of you remember these? Those had temperance as one of its pillars as well. I think. Well, I don't have much more to add. I just think it wasn't so much. It was meant, I think, to be attractive, but also to kind of uphold principles of kind of creating a new kind of community, free of all the negatives that they experienced back in England.
Well, being a farm kid, I noticed that they sent people over, these societies, to say, go purchase some land. So they purchased these blocks of 80-acre parcels. Because they were kind of cash poor, probably, do you suspect that part of the failure was due to the fact that they could only afford probably some standard farmland and kind of what they were stuck with? Plus, they kind of overpromised what it sounds like.
Yeah, they overpromised. They definitely overpromised. Although, if you think about where some of this land is, it's actually pretty good farmland across northern Dane County, into Iowa County. It was the frontier. That was where the edge of white settlement kind of ended in the 1840s. If you look at, back home I have some maps that gave the population by county during Wisconsin Territory in the early years of the state. And once you could kind of draw a line from Prairie du Chien to Green Bay, and there was almost no white people north of that, and many of the counties even south of that line, the numbers were pretty small. So there was a lot of land available. So I don't think they had to take whatever, take the leftovers. But I don't know. Was there an assumption that anybody could be a farmer? Maybe.
Yeah, if you don't know how to farm.
Yeah. Well, of course, it must be in our DNA somehow. That's why I don't think.
Remember the line from Ben Logan in the Land Remembers? He's talking to his dad. He says, "Were you a farmer?" I didn't know anything about it. I was a fisherman.
Yeah.
And I think that's indicative
Yeah.
of most of these things.
And I can share a story. My great-grandfather and grandfather, he was only 6 when they came from Bohemia. They were coal miners. Now, we can never really figure out why they left, because it was just coal mining was kind of going out of, they used up the mines, or was it because there was so much war and conflict in that area in the 1880s? But they came to the United States. Where they end up? They ended up in Coal City, Illinois, coal mining again. And then finally, one day they woke up and said, hey, there's some land in northern Wisconsin. So they moved to northern Wisconsin. They're become farmers. And they have a story where my grandfather tells. It was an Irish family. They were farmers just north of our property. They were going by one day in their wagon. And they looked at these people, looked at my grandfather and said, you have no idea what you're doing, you know, clearing the land. It was all woods. So they helped them out, they helped teach them kind of how to farm. But it was like, and they became successful
You
farmers.
sort of wonder the naivete, you know, just to assume that urban dwellers could automatically be farmers, you know, as if it's
Right.
somehow hardwired into us. You know, and so that was, in addition to the articles that I mentioned, I also published a two-part article in a journal of a family history society over in England that was related to my presentation. The members of the British Temperance and Emigration Society that were from the county of Leicester, which is where this society is located and where my ancestors are from. And there were about 10 who came over, and several of them clearly went back almost right away because there's no further record of them in this country. And several of them, you know, tried to be farmers, and that didn't work out, and they ended up doing other things. So it was sort of a hit and miss kind of thing. Some people figured it out. My ancestors figured it out. They were pretty prosperous. But maybe the only way they figured it out was some other Irish family that came by in a wagon to help them out. I have no idea. I have no idea. Yeah.
Related story, we were in Boise, Idaho a number of years ago, and there's a Basque Immigration Museum or historical location, and we were going through there, and people were saying, well, you know, the Basques came from the old country to be shepherds in Idaho and the West, and people said, yeah, but that doesn't mean they were shepherds in the old country. It just means that sheep didn't care what language you spoke.
I'm sure we could tell similar stories about our own ancestors who did one thing in the old country and then were kind of forced or chose to do something here that perhaps they didn't have any idea what they were doing. So it's amazing that there are as many success stories as there are given those kinds of dynamics.
So when I drive on 14 going out past Mazomini, and I see that Historical Society marker for Dover, and there's nothing else around there.
Yeah.
So what happened? Did they?
Well, you know, like a lot of failed towns, I'm sure some of the buildings remained for a while, others were dismantled, and you know, but that was, you know, and Mazomanie is kind of like Wanakee. It was originally a railroad town. The village grew up because that's where the railroad went.
Right.
And if you know that the legislation that was meant to encourage railroad building, the railroad got free land along the routes where they built. So there was no incentive for them to build railroads through existing, especially small towns. Put it out in the country, you know. Then you don't have to take it through on somebody else's land, or then have to purchase the land from them.
For your railroad.
So Middleton's that same way. The railroad, the original settlement was, you know, where I live, Middleton, was down by where the Stam House is, if you know where the Stam House is. That was the original community there. But the railroad was built up on the hill. And so then the new village began there, Wanakee instead of Leicester Settlement. Mazomanie was that same way, you know. There were, I'm sure there were other stories beyond those that we could tell of.
So then that, like with Dover, it just became useless.
Yeah, I'm sure Frank Wolf's book shows some pictures of buildings that were a part of Dover that were taken in the early part of the 20th century. So some of the buildings were still standing,
Okay.
but there was really no village anymore.
Yeah.
And some of the buildings had been repurposed, you know, for other things. And you know, sometimes they just tear them down and move them someplace else, or just repurpose the materials, because you know, good sawn and milled lumber, you know, it can have a variety of purposes and so on. But I see it, yeah, yes, sir.
Just a dumb question, did they make any pottery?
I'm not aware that they made any pottery, and you know, at least on an industrial scale.
Maybe they made some for the
maybe at home, but that wasn't not part, again, it's this idea that will free you from the squalid conditions of the city and put you out on the land to be farmers and, so. Yeah, there's a certain, well, like I said, I don't think they thought it through very well or understood what they were facing, but, yes, sir.
Early on, most of the so-called farmers girded the trees to kill them and then planted wheat. And that was the big crop in
Right.
Wisconsin. And then in the winter, they worked in the woods. They had jobs as lumberjacks.
Sure, that would make sense, yeah.
And you looked at those Sears catalogs from, late 19th century when they've got stump pullers in there.
Sure.
And you talk about a widowmaker machine. I mean, you got a capstan, you put your team on, and a cable, and I mean, the things that could go wrong between that stump and, I mean, my goodness. There
Yeah,
was no ocean on that bad boy.
yeah.
Or dynamiting stumps.
And then dynamited a lot of them.
Because I had distant relatives back in the early 90s, he died from blowing up stumps.
But dynamiting was expensive,
Yeah,
because you got a lot of stumps, and that it worked, but that was an expensive way to get it out.
yeah.
Yeah.
But it was, there were all kinds, clearing forest, there were a lot of areas that were marshy. It was good soil, but you couldn't work it because it was too soft. We lived in South Bend, Indiana for a number of years, and South Bend was at the far eastern end of what had once been called the Grand Kankakee Marsh. The Kankakee River flows across northern and northwestern Indiana, and I think it runs into the Illinois River, or a river in Illinois. And there were millions of acres of wetland in there that were eventually drained. And I drove through that area, and there were ditches everywhere to collect the water in this rich, black soil. I mean, it took a lot of effort to make that into agricultural land. And then you've got sandy soil, rocky soil, hilly soil, all of the different environments. But yeah, wheat was Wisconsin was the leading state in production of wheat for a while, until that began moving west, and then dairy farming began to have a much bigger part of the agricultural economy. So.
Okay, thank you, Jim.